So let's start looking at what legislative expectations in terms of the board, what's required. So SOCI Act requires an annual CIRMP report must be approved by the board. And when we're talking about the board, it can be the council or governing body. We know we have different setups for different critical infrastructure companies, and submitted on time. There is a statutory deadline. If you miss the deadline, it's non-compliance. Must confirm the CIRMP is up to date and detail any variations to the program. Must demonstrate risk mitigation during the reporting period.
And what this really means for directors it's not a passive sign-off, it's not a process, it's something they need to be engaged in and understand. Approval by the board of the attestation actually equates to endorsement of adequacy. So the board is saying, we believe the CIRMP is adequate mitigation for the risks that we understand we're subject to. It requires an understanding of security risk exposure, and I emphasise that term security risk because we have the view, based on our experience, that boards are quite comfortable with legal risk and financial risks and so on, but security risk beyond physical guards and gates type stuff conceptually could be a more challenging aspect for them to discuss, because as we know through the risk management program, there's 4 hazard types, not just physical, natural and cyber, which they might have some exposure to, but these other 2, supply chain and personnel, in the security risk sense, may not be familiar to them. And it also means that they're endorsing an active oversight. They need to understand what's happening in the risk management program under the hood, as it were, not just be relying on assurance. They need to understand it.
And in terms of duty for those who are directors subject to the Corporations Act, Section 180, the directors must exercise care and diligence, make informed decisions, understand risk exposure, ensure fit-for-profit risk systems, and that's stressed more and more with the directors, which I think attaches even criminal responsibility under the Corporations Act, but that would be relevant probably more to the boards, less to, for example, councils. They will be governed by other legislation means. So the question is, how can the board gain confidence that CIRMP is not only documented, but operating effectively, that it is achieving the security outcome it's supposed to achieve? Because at the end of the day, what we see with the boards, there is a gap, and why boards are exposed. So many boards, from our engagement, we see that they're signing attestation without a defensible understanding of risk. Sometimes attestation is treated as compliance exercise, and there is a compliance fatigue. When we work with different organizations, we hear there are hundreds of pieces of legislation you need to comply. And of course, it's difficult to get attention of the board, depending how often this conversation happens on, or where important as well, and it's not compliance. So there is a need for the shift to risk and outcome-based accountability with the boards. What we see in parallel, we see fragmented ownership, sometimes diffused accountability. Part of it is that with protective security, the way it's evolved, there are still silos within organization, and we see more collaboration across different areas, but still it can be challenging. We see under-resourcing in your areas. So there is an over-reliance by the boards on the goodwill of you. We see lots of great people with the will to drive it, with the will of individuals, but there is an over-reliance on this component by the boards, as if they say, our people will manage. But from what we see, under-resourcing is an issue, probably apart from cyber.
I'll give you a break. I'll go to cyber next. So there is a historical strong cyber focus. You know, cyber security has been with us for 20 plus years, if you like. The other hazard types haven't enjoyed the same sort of focus and attention and I suppose resourcing over that time. The other challenge there is often the CISO, if you like, is seen as the de facto lead in security, can be, and they indeed have the people and the money and often the ear of the board and the CEO. But the CISO probably doesn't know anything much about personnel security, so it's a dangerous mindset to think the CISO's the security person. That is not necessarily the case. In fact, it's unlikely to be the case. Then we also see boards seeing metrics and compliance signals, not really understanding the true risk exposure. And that's where it's very dangerous just to present a dashboard of numbers with green and yellow colours and whatever else. There needs to be some sort of narrative, some sort of story, if you like, so the boards see the totality of the issue, not just the green and red blinking lights.
Thank you.
And the last one, attestation.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. Oh, is attestation confirming compliance, or is it actually truly showing there's an understanding of exposure to risk and how it's being mitigated?
Thank you. So in terms of why boards are not engaging, and we also looked at the research done in the United States and the United Kingdom on the same issue. What stops the board from engaging? What we see that boards are not ignoring security risk. They ignore what they cannot see and quantify. Often security risk is abstract, so not scenario-based. Scenarios or storytelling from what we can see works really well for the boards. And later today we'll provide some solutions in terms of what approaches have worked in probably Five Eyes countries, the States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Reporting is technical, not strategic. And ownership in terms of governance is often unclear.
And ownership's always a tricky one, because in organisations I've been part of as a senior executive, trying to assign risk responsibility or ownership to someone without giving them the clear, I suppose, lines of control and the budget and so on, people will say, well, I can't own that risk. And the reality is in many organisations of a certain size, once you become large enough, it's almost impossible to actually say this is totally on you. No one else has got any input or influence. It's all on you. It doesn't work that way. So the ownership has to be assigned. Someone ultimately has to own it. But how that works in a racy chart manner or some other collaborative manner, very important to nail down. Otherwise, it simply won't work.
Also, there is no clear link to enterprise risk and capital allocation. This is what's really important for you in terms of seeing that the boards understand the future investment program, what you need in terms of resources, what you need in terms of budget, and what needs to be done. So we have been thinking, what are practical ways for you to overcome this challenge, and what's happening now? What can be a good leverage for the conversation with the board?
So there's two elements, I suppose, to the fuel crisis that's been occasioned by the American and Israeli attack on Iran on the 28th of February this year. Firstly, there's ultimately the logistics element. There is now, we are short of fuel and our business is going to suffer and so on. Prices are going up and so on. That also then suggests that your supply chain may have to change. You might go and source fuel from other sources. And when we start to do that, we're starting to get into a security risk scenario in terms of your existing suppliers. You probably understand quite well, and you've done all your due diligence in terms of the legal and modern slave trade, all those sorts of things that you need to do. However, when you must respond to a crisis and you've got to go into the market and find anybody almost that can supply you, then the time for due diligence and the ability to do it effectively is truncated significantly. So we're in a crisis now that will cascade. It won't just be about liquid fuels getting into cars, trucks and aircraft. It's going to then be the secondary effects about packaging, fertiliser, and a number of other things that we can't even really imagine, because most of us don't understand what hydrocarbons go into the supply chain to provide for you as a finished product. So we're in a situation now which is going to go longer. And at this point, if you haven't already started to look at your alternate routes of supply and understand those suppliers, you may well be opening yourself up for significant risk, which the board will have to understand at some point.
So the energy crisis and the supply chain shock actually gives you a good leverage in terms of conversation with the board. If like we step back in time to COVID-19 pandemic to 2020, that was a decision made by government to amend the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act and introduce all those requirements. It was post COVID-19, it was post the supply chain shock to the country that happened that time. So that was one of the key drivers in addition to other threat vectors.